Hi guys, my name is Borrodante. Trying to give up saying hi fronts because for some reason I feel like it's really stupid and I never even call you that anymore. Why do I do this in the intro? But it's kinda hard to give it up anyway. Anyway, let's talk about colors of shadows. Sounds like a sequel for 50 Shades of Grey. So here's the thing. I can't hear myself when I'm wearing this. I wanted to listen to Korn while talking about shadows. Oh well. So, here's the thing. Recently I was reading comments and someone asked me a question. How come that in many theories that they talk about in like academic art and stuff, they talk about warm light and cold shadows. Like whenever you're painting something, you should make shadows with a bit of a colder light than the lit area. And in my case, especially recently, I tend to make shadows not colder, but usually of the same color and more saturated, instead of just making them colder and usually paler, as in classical theory. Well, here's my view on it. If we talk about shadows from the realistic approach, the one that shows a very realistic rich lighting, here we think about the light as a physically perfect phenomenon that has a very strict set of rules. There aren't too many of them, and there is another set of rules that you can wiggle things around with and make the lighting more expressive and tweak it to the mood of whatever you want to express. So that's a pretty good deal, I think. So let's look at that generic theory of cold shadows and warm light. First of all, I don't know, maybe there is a generic rule like that in some kind of expressive style of art. But if we're talking about the realistic lighting, there is only one explanation I can give you about that kind of shadows, when shadows are cold. And that is the outdoors lighting, the sunlight. The point is that if whatever object is located on the ground and it's outdoors, is being lit by a very, very bright sun from one point and a moderately bright sky from all over the place on the top hemisphere, and at the bottom there is generally a very dark soil or asphalt or whatever. The point is that it doesn't really give a lot of reflected light. So we have a pretty much a perfect situation. Just light from the top, clean. So, when the sun is lighting up our object, we make the brightest spot right here, where it perfectly perpendicularly hits the surface with its light, and everything else will be gradually getting darker and darker until we meet the terminator, the area where the surface faces completely away from the light source. We talked about it more than once. So this is the point where warm light of the sun ends, and all that we're left with is only the cold light of the sky. And that is a pretty obvious reason why shadows, I'll explain this later, but shadows are appearing cold. Come to think of it, it's probably a very generic and basic rule for painting landscapes from actual nature. I've heard people actually go outside and paint. So that's the thing, and most of the time you're actually on planet Earth and things work this way. So here we have, this is where looking at the dark ground, dark soil from like 45 degrees top level. And here we have a green ball. Right now it's only lit with a cold skylight. So that's why it's a bit darker than something that we would call bright enough. And then on top, we'll add a more saturated, a little bit, much brighter, because sun, and a bit warmer, because sun. And we'll add this light right here. So if I put a spot right here, that means that the sun is hitting the surface from this point, like this. There's a terminator somewhere around here. Sometimes it gets very soft, sometimes it gets sharper, depending on the roughness of the material. Everything in that tutorial about... What was that tutorial about? I think it was in drawing to painting, right? Yeah, I think it was there. In one of the episodes of Drawing to Painting tutorial, we were talking about this kind of stuff. And at the bottom, we can just push this dark green, dark, cold, pale green, just darker. From this point, there's no need and no excuse to make the shadow even colder, because we already have 0 sun in there. So right now we only make less skylight, and sun is not involved at all. So it's a pretty straightforward darkening. So just do that. In this area. The area of shadow. So right now I painted a cold lit ball that was lit just with skylight, then I added sunlight on top, and then I removed a little bit of skylight at the bottom. So where was the part where I actually painted the shadow? Seems to be the only area is this one, where I actually added something dark at the bottom, but there was no making the ball even colder anymore, so what's up? And the up is the following. There are no shadows. Of course, it's kind of obvious. Everyone understands that shadow is basically the absence of the light. But when it comes to understanding how to distort the color of the object in the shadow, we have to understand that if we still see the object in the shadow, I should stop doing this. You just keep in mind that imagine I always do this. If we still can see the object in the shadow area, that means that we're just looking at a darker light that still lights up this object. It's just darker. We just chose the brighter light to be the main actual light, and then we'll look at a darker light as the shadow. What if there is no sunlight? We're in Ireland. Here, now I removed all the sunlight. But if you ask me, this picture right now looks a bit too dull. Too dark. It kind of makes sense because there is no sun. But whenever you go outside, you look at objects, even if it's cloudy, they still deserve to look bright enough for us to see it nicely, right? In a painting, especially. So basically what it means is that if we actually start from painting the cloudy picture, we would choose a brighter exposition, meaning we would just choose everything to appear brighter for us. You know, the way our eyes and our phone cameras able to do. Whenever we're inside, they capture more light in order for us to see everything. So now I'll just increase the exposure, not with that, but with this. Probably like this, just changing the angle of the curve does just the thing. Well, that's a bit too much. Kinda like this. And now we'll pay a little bit more attention to the ambient light because the contrast increased, and you always have to pay more attention to whatever has a higher contrast. A good rule of thumb. Now the soil became brighter, let's add a bit of ambient shadow onto it as well. We kind of should have done that here as well, and the projected shadow from the sun, but we'll get to the projected shadows later. There we go. Now we're adding the full range of contrast to everything. And this is the moment when everything will stop looking dull. Because now we see that it's not just some dark, low contrast picture, and not just the bright, low contrast picture, but it's actually a full range of contrast, with a dark shadow of the soil right here, and a very brightly lit top area of the ball. Looks satisfying enough. Something like this. Actually, the shadowing would go a pretty long way all over the ball like this. And it's actually, if you really want to work with just ambient lights, with really soft shadows, it's a good idea to pay attention to this. Because the shadow of ambient light, like this kind of ambient shadow, how do I explain this? If it would be like shown in a curve, its brightness, it would be, well, kind of like, if this is the darkest, it would be like this. This is the closest area to the object, and then it becomes much lighter very quickly, but then we still have a little bit of that shadow for a longer distance. So it's kind of like going away quick, but then still has a little bit of effect on the object for a while. And that's why at first we have really dark shadow here, but we make it much brighter very quickly. And then we work with this semi-dark, very soft, smooth gradient all over the ground. Of course, the ball should also go completely black somewhere where it touches the ground, but we're looking at the ball from a little bit of the top area, and we don't see that point of the collision. Like, we're looking from, say, this point of view on the ball. So this is all that we see, and the collision is over there, and in here it would be really dark, and then it quickly would become much lighter due to the same concept as with the ground shadow. So that's why we'll never see a super dark spot on the ball. If you would make a very dark green at the bottom edge of the ball right here, it would feel really weird, as if the ball is actually touching the ground right in front of us, and actually the ball has a shape of something like this, so we would see this collision point from this angle. Now that's messed up, don't do that to the ball. So, as you see, right now we basically painted a whole painting in just the shadow area. There's no light, if the sun is the light. See, there's no difference in brightness of the pictures in general, only the contrast is very different. I haven't paid any attention to the ground in here. It would also be a bit more saturated, a bit brighter, but a little bit, because the object is darker in general. That means its curve of getting brighter is a lot. As in, again, the curves. So, if this is the curve of how the ball gets brighter from the sun, then the dark soil would have this kind of curve. You see, if the ball would be the soil, it would be just this bright at that area. And we have to make the soil about this bright in the sunlit area. Very important. So, something like that. It's already brown, so just, I don't know, a little bit closer to the sun yellow, I guess. No actual necessity. That's too bright. And the projected shadow is somewhere around there. One important thing about projected shadow. No one cares if it's wrong. People only care if it looks wrong. And that's a big difference. Make it looking satisfying and make it looking as it's actually on the ground and doesn't really break any laws of geometry of the object. Like, you know, you can't prove anything kind of mode. So basically I'm adding the sun area everywhere, but the place where I imagined the shadow from the ball would hit the ground. I guess it'll be a bit flatter like this. And it's really important. That's more about the finalizing technique that we discussed in the previous tutorial, the detailing and blending thing. If you're painting a shadow, the projected shadow on the ground, don't paint the illusion that your brain understands about the shadow. Meaning, when we look at the shadow of the ball, we see an ellipse on the ground. We see an actual ellipse as a shape. But there's no ellipse on the ground. It's just the absence of light on the ground. The geometry is just the ground, on which there's just a different amount of light everywhere. What I'm trying to say is, when you put strokes on, follow not the shape of the imaginary ellipse, but more the shape of the ground. Like, the flow of your strokes should follow the geometry and not your stupid illusions that your brain came up with. So the ground is like tilted like this for us because we're looking at an angle, and that means most of the details will have kind of like horizontal lined details everywhere. All kinds of bumps, they will create micro horizons everywhere. And that gives us an idea that the flow of strokes on this object, on this ground, will be horizontal lines. So we just do those. And whenever the line of a detail of the ground won't have any access to the sunlight, we just start painting there with the shadow color instead. Something like this, and then we of course can remove, as you can see, just vertically remove even this skylight color and have a very dark somewhere around there. Again, it's only relatively noticeable at the very beginning, somewhere kind of close enough to the ball, and everything else will be just a very soft, barely noticeable area, like a very smooth gradient. Yeah, there we go. So this is sunny day, this is not so much. There. Looks legit to me. I like the sunny ball better, because the rich gradient from cold to warm, it certainly looks pleasant, right? But this stuff has its own atmosphere, of course. It's kind of cozy and nice, especially if you pay good attention to these super soft gradients of the shadows. They really pay off, especially if you don't have to work with actual sunlight. So if you make the proper soft shadows here, it will look awesome. And now let's talk about the so-called saturated shadows, the death ray. Anyway, that effect happens only because the object reflects the light on itself, making the ambient light area slightly brighter and more saturated. For example, right here we'll clone this sunny day, and let's add a green area over here. For some reason, there is a spot where the ground has the same color as the ball. There we go. Now, suddenly it doesn't look very convincing, and the problem is right here. This ball can't be this dark when there's such a bright area right here, because the sun ray will hit this area and then it will be reflected right over here. And as I mentioned earlier in the reflected light tutorial of the Drawing to Painting series, whenever any light ray gets reflected from any surface, it adopts the color of the surface itself. It becomes darker and closer to the color of the object. And now what we'll do, the best way to go about it, is to grab the color of the shadow that we want to fix. Make it a little bit brighter, and maybe quite a lot more saturated. In some art styles, if you want to go cool and seriously looking like some war or drama going on, you may not even increase saturation and just have reflected lights, but they're still just rather unsaturated. It's like you can play around with that. The main importance is values. So we grab the color of the shadow area that we need to fix. Now we make it a bit brighter. Again, this kind of thing, like how much brighter it's gonna be here, is kind of close to the idea of where to place the projected shadow. Depending on how bright you will make the reflected light, that will tell the viewer how close the surfaces are. So, make them look legit, that's all. So anyway, this is bright enough. But now, since both objects are green, so the reflected sunlight from this surface will be green, and it will be lighting up, again, the green object, green plus green gets really saturated green. And that's why we'll pull this color closer to saturated green. Don't overdo it. So I'm gonna be adding this right here. And softer and less opaque as this lit area goes further away from the ball. And right at the very edge, we can make it even brighter, because it's like really getting close to the reflecting surface. Oh yeah, look at this. Did I paint this, or did someone make a photograph of a real ball? So yeah, that's about it. So the point is that if we would be painting a skin of a character, painting a chin on top of the neck, in here the shadow would be really saturated because the neck and the chest will be reflecting the sunlight or whatever, the main light, over here, and there will be a lot of light bouncing back and forth. And that's why shadows get more saturated, but don't really get colder, because we probably weren't in the skylight area. We were indoors or something. And in that case, you have to just think about where your lights are in the room, what is the general ambience in the room, meaning if there's a lot of red wood furniture, it will probably be a very subtle red ambience in the room. A very subtle, because red wood furniture is really dark, so there's barely any reflection from it. So you just have the color of your object getting darker as it faces away from the light. Unless there's translucency or something like that, but that's another story. Usually it makes sense to add even a little bit of that softly everywhere, like this, in more of a subtle fashion. Just because we made this plane rather big, so it's a pretty major influence on the general ambience from this side of the ball. So in here we don't just have the cold light of the sky, but also this green light of the floor mixing into the ambience, so it will be generally a bit brighter and a bit more green. Something like this. So in conclusion, any shadow is really just visualizing the object at a certain area where there's just -1 of the lights. And there's no solid rule to how to go about it in a way of, all the shadows will be this color. All the shadows will be darker, but you have to think about what kind of color of the light you remove. If the light was warm and the remaining lights are not as warm, then you'll make the object darker. So it's kind of like a math of adding and subtracting different colors of lights. It sounds really complex, but usually you don't work with too much of light sources because it'll look weird anyway. So just a few light sources, and this whole understanding will help you a lot with placing proper colors where you need them, and be happy with yourself. Ask me questions below if you have any. And I thank you for watching if you did. I guess you did if you're here. Leave a like and subscribe. Tell a friend. Imagine that you're talking to a skull when you're recording. Do whatever you want. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.
I wanted to listen to Korn while talking about shadows.